the Impact Disciple Making Podcast. I'm Mike Keaton, your host, and I am joined today with Pastor Ken Adams, lead pastor of Crossroads Church in Newnan, Georgia, and also founder of Impact Disciple Making Ministries. We are having conversations about disciple making, and today we're continuing that conversation with trying to figure out if we're going to be disciple making churches, then spiritual maturity and spiritual growth is a sign of disciple making. And so with that being our topic, Ken, what do you see as signs, or how can we tell as a church that we are truly making disciples?
Well, that's a great topic, and I think it's a topic that we really we ought to be paying attention to, because if what Jesus said is that we are to go and make disciples, and if that is the Great Commission, and that is the thing that Jesus told us to be about until He comes back, then we definitely need to be able to know whether or not the church really is making disciples. And honestly, Mike, the way that we know that's happening is by seeing people grow in their faith, to see people that are maturing spiritually. You know, if you were to go back to the New Testament days, if you were to go back to Jerusalem when the church first started, and you were to find a disciple that was on the street, and you were to go up and ask them if disciples were known for spiritual development or spiritual growth, they would have thought you were crazy, because you would have never thought of a person being a disciple and them not growing and not experiencing spiritual growth. You just never would have thought that. In fact, the word disciple is the Greek word mathete, which literally means to be trained or to be taught. So in the original context, when Jesus was making His disciples, nobody would have ever thought that a disciple would be somebody who is not maturing in their faith or developing spiritually. So the truth is that if a person is becoming a disciple, and then they're going to be growing spiritually. Jesus said it like this in Luke chapter 6, verse 40. Jesus said, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher." You know, Mike, I think the key phrase in that passage is those two words, fully trained. Because, you know, if you think about that, is how could you ever become a fully trained disciple without training? Right. You know, if you put it in the context of education, you know, how would a person, you would never call a person a student if they weren't willing to go to class and read some books and write some papers and do some homework and take some tests. You know, training is a part of the process of becoming a student or learning. And so the exact same thing is true when it comes to making disciples. The church ought to be a place where disciples are being trained. And so that means that we have to be committed to a process of spiritual development, spiritual growth. And so when the church is serious about doing that, then yes, we are going to have spiritually mature disciples will be the result of the ministry of the church. That's the way it all works.
So clearly, Jesus' goal was a fully trained disciple, and it should be ours as well. And if we are going to have a church full of mature disciples, then that leads me to ask the question, so does that mean that we are to expect our church across the board to have only fully mature, fully trained disciples in it?
Well, I would say not if you're healthy. In fact, you do want to be a church that's producing spiritually mature disciples, but you want to have people that are at every stage of spiritual development across the board in your church. So if you're a healthy church, you're going to have a certain percentage of people in the congregation that hopefully are not even Christ followers yet, but they feel comfortable coming and and hearing the message of Jesus. And then you're going to have some in your church body that are going to be really babies in the faith. They're going to be newborns, and they're going to, hopefully you have some people who've just come to faith in Christ. And then a good, healthy church would have some people who are beginning to grow, and some are a little further along. And then you're going to have a percentage of people in your congregation that are actually mature in their faith. And you know, Mike, the sign of maturity is having the ability to reproduce. And that's not just true spiritually, that's true, biologically. That is a sign of maturity. And so that's true for disciples as well. We want to see in our churches disciples being made that have the ability to turn around and to make more disciples. So that would be a healthy church environment.
So if that's the case, and our churches would be healthy across the board like that, and with the condition, when you look at statistics and the condition of today's churches, where they say 80+% are plateaued or declining,
right?
Do you think that we as the church, our church included, have accepted a lack of growth as normative?
Well, I do think that's a problem, and I do think in a lot of churches that's probably more the norm. I like to think of it like this. Here's an analogy that maybe hits close to home. If you were driving by a playground and you were to look over in a playground and see kids playing, and you were to see your typical 5-year-old, sitting in the dirt, playing in the dirt, maybe with his toys in the dirt, throwing dirt all over his head, playing in the dirt, eating a handful of dirt, you would never once look at a 5-year-old and think, well, that's not right, that's not normal. You would expect a 5-year-old to do that. But if you drove by that same park and you saw a 25-year-old playing in the dirt, throwing dirt on his head, and eating a handful of dirt, here's what would happen. Your first thought would be, that's not normal.
That's right.
There is something wrong there. And so, Mike, I think what's happening in a lot of our churches, one of the problems is that we've got people who have been Christians and who have been calling themselves disciples, who have been saved and been involved in church for maybe 15 or 25 or maybe even as much as 30 years, that are still, being spoon-fed and are not reproducing and not making more disciples. And so, Mike, you and I both know if that's the state of the church today, then we're not being obedient to the Great Commission of Jesus Christ.
All right, and we certainly have our work cut out for us.
Yeah, we do.
Well, that's great, Ken. I appreciate that. And that is the goal. The goal is to see disciples mature and develop in their faith to become Christ-like and to represent Him to this world around us. And so to become fully trained, there's obviously some things that you're going to need to know. And that's really going to be the topic of our next podcast. And we'd like to ask you to tune in then to find out what is